3. Matter, energy, and life. After studying this chapter, you should be able to 3.1 Describe matter, elements, and molecules, and give simple examples of the role of 4 major kinds of organic compounds in living cells. 3.2 Define energy, explain how organisms and ecosystems capture and transform energy. 3.3 Define species, populations, communities, and ecosystems, and summarize the ecological significance of trophic levels. 3.4 Understand pathways in the water, carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus cycles. When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world. John Muir. Fishing crews have too often come home with empty nets along much of the Louisiana coast in recent years, as low oxygen levels are killing or driving away marine life. Death by fertilizer, hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. In the 1980s, fishing crews began observing large areas in the Gulf of Mexico, near the Mississippi River mouth, that were nearly devoid of aquatic life in early summer. This region supports shrimp, fish, and oyster fisheries worth $250 to $450 million per year. So this dead zone was an economic disaster, as well as an ecological one. Marine biologists suspected that the Gulf ecosystem was collapsing because of oxygen deprivation. To evaluate the problem, marine scientist Nancy Rabelais began mapping areas of low oxygen concentrations along the Louisiana coast in 1985. Every summer since then, she has found vast areas with oxygen concentrations of less than 2 parts per million. At 2 ppm, nearly all aquatic life, other than microorganisms and primitive worms, is eliminated. In 2017, the Gulf's hypoxic area was a record 22,730 kilometers, an area the size of New Jersey. The 2019 dead zone was nearly as large. What causes this huge dead zone? The familiar process of eutrophication, visible in golf course ponds and city parks, is responsible. Eutrophication is the explosive growth of algae and phytoplankton that occurs when normally scarce nutrients become available. When nutrients become available, especially the elements nitrogen and phosphorus, they allow explosive growth of aquatic plants and algae. Overabundant plants then die off, and decomposers use up nearly all available oxygen. Oxygen depletion is especially severe near the seabed where dead matter falls and collects. Rabelais and her team observed that each year, following spring rains in the farmlands of the upper Mississippi watershed, oxygen concentrations in the Gulf would drop from 5 ppm to less than 2 ppm. Spring rains wash nutrient-rich soil, organic debris, and fertilizers from farm fields. Pulses of agricultural runoff from as far away as Montana and Pennsylvania contribute to eutrophic conditions in the Gulf. In addition to oxygen depletion, putrefying sediments also produce hydrogen sulfide, which further poisons the water near the seafloor. In well-mixed water bodies, such as the open ocean, oxygen from the surface mixes down into lower layers. But warm, protected water bodies like the Gulf are often stratified. Abundant sunlight keeps the upper layers warmer and less dense than lower layers. Cold, dense layers lie stable at depth, and fresh oxygen from the surface can't mix downward. Fish may be able to swim away from the hypoxic zone, but bottom dwellers often simply die. Widespread fish kills are also associated with hypoxia in enclosed waters. The dead zone in the Gulf is especially severe because the area receives runoff from the enormous Mississippi-Missouri watershed, where abundant agriculture makes nutrient runoff unusually high. First observed in the 1970s, dead zones now occur along the coast of nearly every major populated region. The number increases almost every year, and more than 600 are now known. They occur mainly in enclosed coastal waters, which tend to be stratified and are vulnerable to nutrient influxes, such as Chesapeake Bay, Long Island Sound, the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, and China's Baha'i Bay. But they have also been observed on open coastlines. Can dead zones recover? Yes. If the influx of nitrogen stops, the system can return to normal. In 1996 in the Black Sea region, farmers in collapsing communist economies were forced to cut nitrogen fertilizer use in half as fertilizer subsidies collapsed. The Black Sea dead zone disappeared, while farmers saw little decline in their crop yields. But in the Mississippi River watershed, farmers upstream are far from the Gulf and its fisheries. Midwestern policymakers have shown little interest in what happens to fisheries in Louisiana. The flow of nitrogen reaching U.S. coastal waters has grown by 8-fold since the 1950s. Phosphorus, another key nutrient, has tripled. Despite decades of efforts to control nutrients upstream, the dead zone has continued to grow, as intensification of agriculture upstream continues. The movement of nutrients and energy determines how ecosystems function, and how organisms and biological communities flourish or collapse. These topics set the stage for much of the rest of our study of environmental science. In this chapter, we examine terms of matter and energy, key elements in living systems, and how they shape ecosystems and communities. Figure 3.1a Hypoxic, dead zone, about the size of New Jersey, forms in the Gulf of Mexico each summer, the result of nutrients from the Mississippi River. 3.1 Elements of life. From living organisms to ecosystems, life can be understood in terms of the movement of matter and energy. To understand how matter and energy cycle through living systems, we must understand how atoms bond to form compounds. Carbon-based compounds are the foundation of organisms. The accumulation and transfer of energy and nutrients allows living systems, including yourself, to exist. These processes tie together the parts of an ecosystem or an organism. In this chapter, we'll introduce a number of concepts that are essential to understanding how living things function in their environment. These concepts include fundamental ideas of matter and energy, the ways organisms acquire and use energy, and the nature of chemical elements. We then apply these ideas to feeding relationships among organisms, the ways that energy and nutrients are passed from one living thing to another. In other words, we'll trace components from atoms to elements to compounds to cells to organisms to ecosystems. Table 3.1 Functions of some common elements. Function elements comments fertilizers N nitrogen, P phosphorus, K potassium. Essential components of proteins, cells, other biological compounds, crucial fertilizers for plants. Organic compounds. C carbon, O oxygen, H hydrogen. Form the basic structure of cells and other components of living things, in combination with many other elements. Metals Fe, iron, Al, aluminum, Au, gold. Generally malleable, most react readily with other elements. Toxic elements. Pb, lead, Hg, mercury, as arsenic. Many are metals that can interfere with processes in nervous systems. Atoms, elements, and compounds. Everything that takes up space and has mass is matter. Matter exists in 4 distinct states, or phases: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma, which vary in energy intensity and the arrangement of particles that make up the substance. Water, for example, can exist as ice, as liquid water, or as water vapor. The fourth phase, plasma, occurs when matter is heated so intensely that electrons are released and particles become ionized. We can observe plasma in the sun, lightning, and very hot flames. Under ordinary circumstances, matter is neither created nor destroyed, rather, it is recycled over and over again. This idea is known as the principle of conservation of matter. The molecules that make up your body may contain atoms that once were part of the body of a dinosaur. Most certainly, you contain atoms that were part of many smaller prehistoric organisms. This is because chemical elements are used and reused by living organisms. Matter is transformed and combined in different ways, but it doesn't disappear, everything goes somewhere. How does this principle apply to environmental science? It explains how components of environmental systems are intricately connected. In an agricultural watershed, or in your own household, all matter comes from somewhere and all waste goes somewhere. Pause to consider the source of nutrients causing hypoxia in the Gulf. How far back can you trace their origins? Also think about what you have consumed or acquired today. Where did it come from, and where will it go when you are done with it? You are intricately tied to both the sources and the destinations of everything you use. This is a useful idea for us as residents of a finite world. Ultimately, when we throw away our disposable goods, they don't really go away, they just go somewhere else, to stay there for a while and then move on. Matter consists of elements, such as carbon or oxygen. Each of the 122 known elements has distinct chemical characteristics. Just 4 elements, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, are responsible for more than 96% of the mass of most living organisms. A relatively short list makes up most of the rest. Shortages or excesses of these elements can dramatically destabilize ecosystems. See if you can find these elements in the periodic table of the elements. Atoms are the smallest particles that exhibit the characteristics of an element. Atoms are composed of positively charged protons, negatively charged electrons, and electrically neutral neutrons. Protons and neutrons, which have approximately the same mass, are clustered in the nucleus in the center of the atom. Electrons, which are tiny in comparison to the other particles, orbit the nucleus at the speed of light. Each element has a characteristic number of protons per atom, called its atomic number. Carbon, for example, has 6 protons, so its atomic number is 6. Each element also has a characteristic atomic mass, which is the sum of protons and neutrons. Carbon normally has 6 neutrons and 6 protons, which sum to an atomic mass of 12. However, the number of neutrons can vary slightly. Forms of the same element that differ in number of neutrons are called isotopes. For example, some carbon atoms have 7 or 8 neutrons. These atoms have a mass of 13 or 14, rather than the usual 12. Similarly, hydrogen is the lightest element, and normally it has just 1 proton and 1 electron and an atomic mass of 1. A small percentage of hydrogen atoms also have a neutron in the nucleus, which gives those atoms an atomic mass of 2. We call this isotope deuterium. An even smaller percentage of natural hydrogen, called tritium, has 1 proton plus 2 neutrons. Oxygen atoms can also have 1 or 2 extra neutrons, making them the isotopes O or O, instead of the normal O. This difference is important in environmental science. Oxygen isotopes, for example, tell us about ancient climates. Water containing O is slightly more massive than water containing the normal O. The higher mass HO evaporates into the air more easily in hot climates, where there is plenty of evaporative energy, than in cold climates. When we examine bubbles of ancient air trapped in ice cores, abundant O indicates a relatively warm ancient climate. Lower amounts of O indicate a colder climate. Some isotopes are unstable, that is, they spontaneously emit electromagnetic energy, or subatomic particles, or both. Radioactive waste and nuclear energy are both environmentally hazardous, because they involve unstable isotopes of elements, such as uranium and plutonium. Benchmark data. Among the ideas and values in this chapter, the following are a few worth remembering. 7 pH of neutral substances 16, 18 atomic mass of normal oxygen, and a heavy isotope. 1/10 approximate energy remaining at successive levels of a trophic pyramid. 2:1 nitrogen captured from atmosphere by human, natural processes. Figure 3.2. As difficult as it may be to imagine, when you look at a solid object, all matter is composed of tiny, moving particles, separated by space and held together by energy. It is hard to capture these dynamic relationships in a drawing. This model represents carbon-12, with a nucleus of 6 protons and 6 neutrons. The 6 electrons are represented as a fuzzy cloud of potential locations rather than as individual particles. Chemical bonds hold molecules together. Atoms often join to form compounds, or substances composed of different kinds of atoms. If a pair or group of atoms can exist as a single unit, it is known as a molecule. Some elements commonly occur as molecules, such as molecular oxygen or molecular nitrogen N. 2. And some compounds can exist as molecules, such as glucose C. 6. H. 12. O. 6. In contrast to these molecules, sodium chloride is a compound that cannot exist as a single pair of atoms. Instead, it occurs in a solid mass of Na and Cl atoms, or as 2 ions, Na and Cl, dissolved in solution. Most molecules consist of only a few atoms. But many, such as proteins and nucleic acids, discussed below, can include millions or even billions of atoms. Electrical attraction holds atoms together to form compounds. When ions with opposite charges form a compound, the electrical attraction holding them together is an ionic bond. Sometimes neither atom readily gives up an electron to the other, as when 2 hydrogen atoms meet. In this case, atoms form bonds by sharing electrons. 2 hydrogen atoms can bond by sharing a pair of electrons. They orbit the 2 hydrogen nuclei equally and hold the atoms together. Such electron-sharing bonds are known as covalent bonds. Carbon can form covalent bonds simultaneously with 4 other atoms, so carbon can create complex structures, such as sugars and proteins, or hydrocarbons like methane. Atoms in covalent bonds do not always share electrons evenly. An important example in environmental science is the covalent bonds in water. The oxygen atom attracts the shared electrons more strongly than do the 2 hydrogen atoms. Consequently, the hydrogen portion of the molecule has a slight positive charge, while the oxygen has a slight negative charge. These charges create a mild attraction between water molecules, making water somewhat cohesive. This fact helps explain some of the remarkable properties of water that we'll discuss in the next section. When an atom gives up 1 or more electrons, we say it is oxidized. When an atom gains electrons, we say it is reduced. Oxidation and reduction reactions are necessary for life. Oxidation of sugar and starch molecules, for example, is an important part of how you gain energy from food. Forming bonds usually releases energy. Breaking bonds generally requires energy. Think of this in burning wood. Carbon-rich organic compounds such as cellulose are broken, which requires some activation energy. Carbon atoms released from the wood then form bonds with oxygen from the air, making CO and releasing heat. In a fire, more energy is produced than is consumed, and the net effect is that it feels hot to us. Generally, some energy input is needed to start these reactions. In your fireplace, a match might provide the needed activation energy. In your car, a spark from the battery provides activation energy to initiate the oxidation of gasoline. Figure 3.3. These common molecules, with atoms held together by covalent bonds, are important components of the atmosphere, or are important pollutants. Unique properties of water. If travelers from another solar system were to visit our lovely, cool, blue planet, they might call it aqua rather than terra, because of its outstanding feature, the abundance of streams, rivers, lakes, and oceans of liquid water. Our planet is the only place we know where water exists, as a liquid in any appreciable quantity. Water covers nearly 3/4 of the Earth's surface, and moves around constantly via the hydrologic cycle that distributes nutrients, replenishes freshwater supplies, and shapes the land. Water makes up 60 to 70% of the weight of most living organisms. It fills cells, giving form and support to tissues. Among water's unique, even serendipitous qualities are the following. 1. Water molecules are polar. They have a slight positive charge on one side and a slight negative charge on the other side. Therefore, water readily dissolves polar, or ionic substances, including sugars and nutrients, and carries materials to and from cells. 2. Water is the only inorganic substance that normally exists as a liquid at temperatures suitable for life. Most substances exist as either a solid or a gas. They are liquid only in a very narrow temperature range. Organisms synthesize organic compounds, such as oils and alcohols, that remain liquid at ambient temperatures, and are therefore extremely valuable to life, but the original and predominant liquid in nature is water. 3. Water molecules are cohesive. They hold together tenaciously and create high surface tension. You have experienced this property if you have ever done a belly flop off a diving board. Water has the highest surface tension of any common, natural liquid. Water also adheres to surfaces. As a result, water is subject to capillary action. It can be drawn into small channels. Without capillary action, movement of water and nutrients into groundwater reservoirs and through living organisms might not be possible. 4. Water is unique in that it expands when it crystallizes. Most substances shrink as they change from liquid to solid. Ice floats because it is less dense than liquid water. When temperatures fall below freezing, the surface layers of lakes, rivers, and oceans cool faster and freeze before deeper water. Floating ice then insulates underlying layers, keeping most water bodies liquid throughout the winter in most places. Without this feature, many aquatic systems would freeze solid in winter. 5. Water has a high heat of vaporization. It takes a great deal of heat to convert from liquid to vapor. Consequently, evaporating water is an effective way for organisms to shed excess heat. Many animals pant or sweat to moisten evaporative cooling surfaces. Why do you feel less comfortable on a hot, humid day than on a hot, dry day? Because the water vapor-laden air inhibits the rate of evaporation from your skin, thereby impairing your ability to shed heat. 6. Water also has a high specific heat. A great deal of heat is absorbed before it changes temperature. The slow response of water to temperature change helps moderate global temperatures, keeping the environment warm in winter and cool in summer. This effect is especially noticeable near the ocean, but it is important globally. All these properties make water a unique and vitally important component of the ecological cycles that transfer matter and energy, and that make life on Earth possible. Figure 3.4 surface tension is demonstrated by the resistance of a water surface to penetration, as when it is walked upon by a water strider. Ions react and bond to form compounds. Atoms frequently gain or lose electrons, acquiring a negative or positive electrical charge. Charged atoms are called ions. Negatively charged ions are anions. Positively charged ions are cations. A hydrogen atom, for example, can give up its sole electron to become a hydrogen ion. Chlorine readily gains electrons, forming chlorine ions. Substances that readily give up hydrogen ions in water are known as acids. Hydrochloric acid, for example, dissociates in water to form H and Cl ions. In later chapters, you may read about acid rain, ocean acidification, acid mine drainage, and other environmental concerns. In general, acids can cause environmental damage because the H ions react readily with living tissues and with non-living substances. Substances that readily bond with H ions are called bases or alkaline substances. Sodium hydroxide, for example, releases hydroxide ions that bond with H ions in water. Bases can be highly reactive, so they also cause significant damage to living organisms. But acids and bases also are essential to living things. The acids in your stomach dissolve food, for example, and acids in soil help make nutrients available to growing plants. We describe the strength of an acid and base by its pH, the negative logarithm of its concentration of H+ ions. Acids have a pH below 7, bases have a pH greater than 7. A solution of exactly pH 7 is neutral. Because the pH scale is logarithmic, pH 6 represents 10 times more hydrogen ions in solution than pH 7. A solution can be neutralized by adding buffer substances that accept or release hydrogen ions. In the environment, for example, alkaline rock can buffer acidic precipitation, decreasing its acidity. Lakes with acidic bedrock, such as granite, are especially vulnerable to acid rain because they have little buffering capacity. Quantitative reasoning. The pH scale shows the availability of reactive hydrogen ions in a liquid. The scale is logarithmic, so milk has 10 times as many H ions as pure water for a given volume. How many more H ions does normal rain have compared to pure water? Soda pop. Vinegar. Is seawater more acidic or more basic than pure water? Figure 3.5 The pH scale. The numbers represent the negative logarithm of the hydrogen ion concentration in water. Alkaline solutions have a pH greater than 7. Acids have high concentrations of reactive H ions. Organic compounds have a carbon backbone. Organisms use some elements in abundance, others in trace amounts, and others not at all. Certain vital substances are concentrated within cells, while others are actively excluded. Carbon is a particularly important element, because chains and rings of carbon atoms form the skeletons of organic compounds, the material of which biomolecules, and therefore living organisms, are made. There are 4 major categories of organic compounds in living things: lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. Lipids store energy for cells, and they provide the core of cell membranes and other structures. Lipids do not readily dissolve in water, and their basic structure is a chain of carbon atoms with attached hydrogen atoms. A general term for compounds with this structure is hydrocarbons. Fossil fuels, such as oil and propane, are hydrocarbons derived from living organisms. Carbohydrates also have a basic structure of carbon atoms, but hydroxyl groups replace half the hydrogen atoms. Like lipids, carbohydrates store energy and provide structure to cells. Glucose is an example of a very simple sugar. Most carbohydrates are much larger and more complex. Proteins are composed of chains of subunits called amino acids. Folded into complex 3-dimensional shapes, proteins provide structure to cells and are used for countless cell functions. Most enzymes, such as those that release energy from lipids and carbohydrates, are proteins. Proteins also help identify disease-causing microbes, make muscles move, transport oxygen to cells, and regulate cell activity. Nucleotides are complex molecules made of a 5-carbon sugar, one or more phosphate groups, and an organic nitrogen-containing base called either purine or pyrimidine. Nucleotides serve many functions. They carry information between cells, tissues, and organs. They are sources of energy for cells. They also form long chains called ribonucleic acid or deoxyribonucleic acid that are essential for storing and expressing genetic information. Just 4 kinds of nucleotides make up all DNA, but there can be billions of these molecules lined up in a very specific sequence. Long chains of DNA bind together to form a stable double helix. These chains separate and are duplicated when cells divide, so that genetic information is replicated. DNA molecules are responsible for differences among species and among individuals. Because they determine traits like growth rates and disease tolerance, DNA modification is now a dominant type of research in biology. Figure 3.6. The 4 major groups of biologically important organic molecules are based on repeating subunits of these carbon-based structures. Basic structures are shown for butyric acid and a hydrocarbon, a simple carbohydrate, a protein, and a nucleotide. Figure 3.7. A composite molecular model of DNA. The lower part shows individual atoms, while the upper part has been simplified to show the strands of the double helix held together by hydrogen bonds between matching nucleotides. A complete DNA molecule contains millions of nucleotides and carries genetic information for many specific, inheritable traits. Cells are the fundamental units of life. All living organisms are composed of cells, minute compartments within which the processes of life are carried out. Microscopic organisms such as bacteria, some algae, and protozoa are composed of single cells. Higher organisms have many cells, usually with many different cell varieties. Your body, for instance, is composed of several trillion cells of about 200 distinct types. Every cell is surrounded by a thin, but dynamic membrane of lipid and protein that receives information about the exterior world and regulates the flow of materials between the cell and its environment. Inside, cells are subdivided into tiny organelles and subcellular particles that provide the machinery for life. Some of these organelles store and release energy. Others manage and distribute information. Still others create the internal structure that gives the cell its shape and allows it to fulfill its role. A special class of proteins, called enzymes, carry out all the chemical reactions required to create these various structures. Enzymes also provide energy and materials to carry out cell functions, dispose of wastes, and perform other functions of life at the cellular level. Enzymes are molecular catalysts. They regulate chemical reactions without being used up or inactivated in the process. Like hammers or wrenches, they do their jobs without being consumed or damaged as they work. There are generally thousands of different kinds of enzymes in every cell, which carry out the many processes on which life depends. Altogether, the multitude of enzymatic reactions performed by an organism is called its metabolism. Figure 3.7. A composite molecular model of DNA. The lower part shows individual atoms, while the upper part has been simplified to show the strands of the double helix held together by hydrogen bonds between matching nucleotides. A complete DNA molecule contains millions of nucleotides and carries genetic information for many specific, inheritable traits. Figure 3.8. Plant tissues and a single cell's interior. Cell components include a cellulose cell wall, a nucleus, a large empty vacuole, and several chloroplasts, which carry out photosynthesis. Exploring science. Gene editing. Selective breeding has long been used to improve the characteristics of domestic plants and animals. But the process has been slow and rather unpredictable. With the development of molecular genetics, our ability to tailor organisms has improved considerably, but modifying specific genes has remained difficult and prone to errors. The discovery of a bacterial system for editing genes, however, may unleash a gold rush in genetic engineering. This bacterial gene editing system is called CRISPR, which stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats. CRISPR uses short sequences of genetic material to attach to specific sections of DNA in a cell. It then uses an enzyme to cut the DNA in specific places. Bacteria use this process to cut and disable the DNA of invading viruses. Now geneticists have realized that this bacterial process could be used to recognize and modify, or edit, genes in higher plants and animals. Just as bacteria target the DNA of an invading virus, CRISPR uses molecules synthesized to bind to and cut any gene we want to edit. When a target DNA sequence is identified and cut, it can inactivate the gene. As the cell tries to repair broken DNA, CRISPR can supply a template for new versions of the target gene to replace the original sequence. Think of this as a molecular version of the search and replace function in your word processor. The tool is being used in experiments to make human cells impervious to HIV, to correct a mutation that leads to blindness, and to cure mice of muscular dystrophy, cataracts, and a hereditary liver disease. It has been used to improve wheat, rice, soybeans, tomatoes, and oranges. Libraries of tens of thousands of DNA sequences are now available to target and activate, or silence, specific genes. An exciting feature of CRISPR is that it can modify multiple genes at the same time. Eventually, this may help us treat complex diseases, such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, that are regulated by many genes. CRISPR has also become the latest stage in the debate about genetically modified organisms. On one hand, CRISPR makes it easier, quicker, and less expensive to create modified genomes. This will probably make GMOs more abundant. CRISPR edits genes much more precisely than other tools. Previous methods of creating GMOs generally involved blasting cells with chunks of DNA, often from unrelated species, and the outcome was often uncertain. Gene editing with CRISPR is far more precise and predictable. The implications of modified organisms for the ecosystems. Gene editing with CRISPR is far more precise and predictable. The implications of modified organisms for the ecosystems or social systems they inhabit, however, remain harder to predict. In 2018, researchers in China shocked the medical and scientific community when they reported the birth of twin girls with DNA tweaked using CRISPR to make them resistant to HIV. The scientific community has long observed an unofficial moratorium on modifying viable human embryos. The ethical implications of modifying humans at will are enormous and complex. They are the stuff of science fiction. Will the rich produce designer superbabies? Will we generate drone classes, or create superhumans with physical perfection, but lacking social traits that cannot be biologically engineered, such as empathy? Thus far, most genetic engineering has flown the flag of social progress and altruism, promising nutrient-enriched rice or edible vaccines, but the industry focuses on products with the highest economic return, such as crops engineered to tolerate pesticides. These crops are worth billions of dollars per year and now dominate agricultural production. They have greatly increased use of pesticides and helped drive smaller farmers out of business. We may have the technology, but do we have the wisdom or the self-restraint to use it for the betterment of society? Why is this important in environmental science? Observers have worried that genetic engineering could produce superbugs, causing new epidemic diseases or disrupting ecosystems. On the other hand, CRISPR has been used in efforts to control invasive Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, which carry Zika virus and dengue fever, by producing and releasing modified mosquitoes that mate with wild relatives and produce non-viable larvae. In Brazilian tests, the number of observed Aedes aegypti larvae dropped by 82% in only 8 months. This approach could aid disease control without blasting ecosystems with powerful pesticides. What do you think? If you were appointed to a regulatory panel commissioned to oversee gene editing, what limits, if any, would you impose on this new technology? Figure 1 experiments with CRISPR have modified genes and edited inherited traits in lab mice and other organisms. Section Review. 1. Define atom and element. Are these terms interchangeable? 2. What differentiates acids from bases? Give an example of each. 3. What are 6 characteristics of water that make it so valuable for living organisms and their environment? 3.1 Elements of life. Matter. Everything that has mass and takes up space is measurable. Solid, liquid, gas, plasma equals 4 states of matter. Matter cannot be destroyed, but is simply transformed from one form to another. This is the principle of conservation of matter. Earth is a closed system, so matter is recycled over and over. Elements. Matter consists of elements. Elements, substances that cannot be broken down into simpler forms by ordinary chemical reactions. 122 elements, just 4 make up 96% of the mass of living organisms. Sand is matter. What elements is it made of? Elements of life. All elements are composed of atoms. Atoms, smallest particles exhibiting characteristics of the element. Atoms are composed of protons, neutrons, electrons. Protons and neutrons are in the nucleus, electrons orbit the nucleus. Atomic number of protons. Example, carbon has an atomic number of 6. How many electrons and neutrons does carbon have? What about silicon? What is its atomic number? Example, silicon atom. How many protons does silicon have? How many electrons? How are the electrons arranged around the nucleus? Why is this important? Example, carbon isotopes. Isotope forms of an element differing in atomic mass, because the isotopes have different numbers of neutrons. Would an isotope be heavier or lighter than its stable form? Example, global warming, chemical bonds. Reactions join elements together to form molecules, 2 or more atoms joined together. Chemical bonds. Chemical bond forces holding atoms together in molecules. Ionic atoms with opposite charges form a bond, e.g. Na+ and Cl. Covalent atoms share electrons. For example, in water the oxygen attracts the electrons more strongly than the hydrogens do, so the hydrogens have a slight positive charge, and the oxygen a slight negative charge. Common molecules. Oxidation and reduction. Reactions are just the transfer, or sharing of electrons. When an atom gains electrons, it is reduced. Oxidation and reduction are an important part of how organisms gain energy from food. Forming bonds uses energy, breaking bonds releases energy. Activation energy is often needed to begin a reaction. Example, combustion is an oxidation-reduction reaction. To see where the electrons are transferred, watch the hydrogen atoms. Ions, acids, and bases. Ions, atoms that have a positive or negative charge, because they have more or less electrons than protons. Anions have a negative charge. Cations have a positive charge. Acids, substances that release hydrogen ions in water. Bases, substances that readily bond with hydrogen ions. pH scale. 0 to 7 is acidic, a 7 is neutral, a 8 to 14 is basic. The pH scale. Organic compounds. Organic compounds, material making up biomolecules, which in turn make up living things. All organic compounds contain carbon. 4 major categories of organic compounds. Lipids. Carbohydrates. Proteins. Nucleic acids. Lipids, fats, oils, waxes, cell membranes. Carbohydrates, simple sugars, starches, glycogen, cellulose. Proteins, enzymes, cell transport, storage, communication, etc. Nucleic acids, DNA, RNA, act in information storage. Cells. Cells, minute compartments in a living organism, which carry out processes of life. Surrounded by lipid membrane, controlling flow of materials in and out of cell. Interior may be subdivided into organelles and subcellular particles. Plant cells surrounded by cell membranes. Enzymes. Enzymes, molecular catalysts regulating chemical reactions. Enzymes are usually proteins. Metabolism, multitude of enzymatic reactions performed by an organism. 3.2 Energy for life. Energy occurs in different forms, such as kinetic energy, potential energy, chemical energy, or heat. The laws of thermodynamics state that energy is neither created nor destroyed, but that energy degrades to low-intensity forms when used. Nearly all energy in ecosystems is captured from sunlight by photosynthesis. It is released through cellular respiration. Energy is the ability to do work, such as moving matter over a distance or causing a heat transfer between two objects at different temperatures. Energy can take many different forms. Heat, light, electricity, and chemical energy are examples that we all experience. Here we examine differences between forms of energy. Energy varies in intensity. The energy contained in moving objects is called kinetic energy. A rock rolling down a hill, the wind blowing through the trees, water flowing over a dam, or electrons speeding around the nucleus of an atom are all examples of kinetic energy. Potential energy is stored energy that is latent but available for use. A rock poised at the top of a hill and water stored behind a dam are examples of potential energy. Chemical energy is potential energy stored in the chemical bonds of molecules. The energy provided by the food you eat and the gasoline you put into your car are also examples of chemical energy that can be released to do useful work. Energy is often measured in units of heat or work. 1 joule is the work done when 1 kilogram is accelerated at 1 meter per second per second. 1 calorie is the amount of energy needed to heat 1 gram of pure water 1 degree Celsius. A calorie can also be measured as 4.184 J. Heat is the energy that can be transferred between objects due to their difference in temperature. When a substance absorbs heat, the kinetic energy of its molecules increases. We sense this as a change in temperature. If enough heat is added, the substance may change to a different phase. A solid may become a liquid, or a liquid may become a gas. Note that when a substance changes phase, the added energy is used in the phase change, not in raising the temperature we sense. So as water evaporates, the process of evaporation takes heat from the environment, but the water vapor is not warmer than the liquid water. An object can have a high heat content, but a low temperature, such as a lake that freezes slowly in the fall. Other objects, like a burning match, have a high temperature but little heat content. Heat storage in lakes and oceans is essential to moderating climates and maintaining biological communities. Heat absorbed in phase changes is also critical. As you will read in Chapter 15, evaporation and condensation of water in the atmosphere help distribute heat around the globe. Energy that is diffused, dispersed, and low in temperature is considered low-quality energy, because it is difficult to gather and use for productive purposes. The heat stored in the oceans, for instance, is immense but hard to capture and use, so it is low quality. Conversely, energy that is intense, concentrated, and high in temperature is high-quality energy, because of its usefulness in carrying out work. The intense flames of a very hot fire, or high-voltage electrical energy, are examples of high-quality forms that are valuable to humans. Many of our alternative energy sources are diffuse compared to the higher quality, more concentrated chemical energy in oil, coal, or gas. This can mean that alternative energy sources are less intense and less easy to use for work than oil or gas. Figure 3.9 Water stored behind this dam represents potential energy. Water flowing over the dam has kinetic energy, some of which is converted to heat. Thermodynamics regulates energy transfers. Atoms and molecules cycle endlessly through organisms and their environment, but energy flows in a one-way path. A constant supply of energy, nearly all of it from the sun, is needed to keep biological processes running. Energy can be used repeatedly as it flows through the system, and it can be stored temporarily in the chemical bonds of organic molecules, but eventually it is released and dissipated. The study of thermodynamics deals with the rates of flow and the transformation of energy from one form or quality to another. Thermodynamics is a complex, quantitative discipline, but you don't need a great deal of math to understand some of the broad principles that shape our world and our lives. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy is conserved, that is, it is neither created nor destroyed under normal conditions. Energy may be transformed, for example, from the energy in a chemical bond to heat energy, or from kinetic energy to an electrical current, but the total amount does not change. The second law of thermodynamics states that, with each successive energy transfer, or transformation in a system, less energy is available to do work. That is, energy is degraded to lower quality forms, or it dissipates and is lost, as it is used. When you drive a car, for example, the chemical energy of the gas is degraded to kinetic energy and heat, which dissipates, eventually, to space. The second law recognizes that disorder, or entropy, tends to increase in all natural systems. Consequently, there is always less useful energy available when you finish a process than there was before you started. Because of this loss, everything in the universe tends to fall apart, slow down, and get more disorganized. How does the second law of thermodynamics apply to organisms and biological systems? Organisms are highly organized, both structurally and metabolically. Constant care and maintenance is required to keep up this organization, and a constant supply of energy is required to maintain these processes. Every time some energy is used by a cell to do work, some of that energy is dissipated or lost as heat. If cellular energy supplies are interrupted or depleted, the result sooner or later is death. Ecosystems run on energy. All ecosystems require constant inputs of energy to function. Nearly all ecosystems rely on the sun for this energy. A few types of ecosystems, though, survive without sunlight by capturing other energy sources. Deep-sea hydrothermal systems are an example. Until recently, the deep ocean floor was believed to be essentially lifeless. Cold, dark, subject to crushing pressures, and without any known energy supply, it was a place where scientists thought nothing could survive. Undersea explorations in the 1970s, however, revealed dense colonies of animals, blind shrimp, giant tube worms, strange crabs, and bizarre clams clustered around vents called black chimneys, where boiling hot, mineral-laden water bubbles up through cracks in the Earth's crust. How do these sunless ecosystems get energy? The answer is chemosynthesis, the process in which bacteria use chemical bonds between inorganic elements, such as hydrogen sulfide, H2, S, or hydrogen gas, to provide energy for synthesis of organic molecules. Discovering organisms living under the severe conditions of deep-sea hydrothermal vents led to exploration of other sites that seem exceptionally harsh to us. Fascinating organisms have been discovered in hot springs, such as in Yellowstone National Park, in intensely salty lakes, and even in deep rock formations, up to 1,500 m deep in Columbia River basalts. Some species are amazingly hardy. The single-celled organism Pyrolobus fumarii can withstand temperatures up to 113 degrees Celsius. Most of these extremophiles are archaea, single-celled organisms that are thought to be the most primitive of all living organisms, and the conditions under which they live are thought to be similar to those in which life first evolved. Deep-sea exploration of areas without thermal vents also has found abundant life. We now know that archaea live in oceanic sediments in astonishing numbers. The deepest of these species make methane from gaseous hydrogen, H2, and carbon dioxide, CO2, derived from rocks. Other species oxidize methane using sulfur to create hydrogen sulfide, which is consumed by bacteria, that serves as a food source for more complex organisms such as tube worms, crabs, and shrimp. Methane-using bacteria can also help clean up pollution. After the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, a deep-sea bloom of methane-metabolizing bacteria apparently consumed most of the methane escaping the spill. In more familiar ecosystems that surround us, energy comes from the sun. Our sun is a star-a fiery ball of exploding hydrogen gas. Its energy comes from fission of hydrogen atoms, an intense and searing energy source that produces an abundant flow of radiative energy. Radiation occurs in a wide range of wavelengths. Most solar energy is emitted in a relatively narrow range of wavelengths, which we perceive as light. Solar energy is essential to life for two main reasons. First, the sun provides warmth. Most organisms survive within a relatively narrow temperature range. Above 40 degrees Celsius, most biomolecules begin to break down or become distorted and non-functional. At low temperatures, some chemical reactions of metabolism occur too slowly to enable organisms to grow and reproduce. Other planets in our solar system are either too hot or too cold to support life as we know it. The Earth's water and atmosphere help to moderate, maintain, and distribute the sun's heat. Second, as we have noted, nearly all organisms on the Earth's surface depend on solar radiation for life-sustaining energy, which is captured by green plants, algae, and some bacteria through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis converts radiant energy into high-quality chemical energy in the bonds that hold together organic molecules. Photosynthetic organisms capture roughly 105 billion metric tons of carbon every year and store it as biomass. About half of this carbon capture is on land, about half is in the ocean. Plants use the abundant visible range of the spectrum, just as our eyes do, as well as near-infrared. These wavelengths pass easily through our Earth's atmosphere and reach the surface. About 45% of the radiation at the surface is visible, another 45% is infrared, and 10% is ultraviolet. Of the visible wavelengths, photosynthesis uses mainly red and blue light. Most plants reflect green wavelengths, so they appear to us. Half of the energy plants absorb is used in evaporating water. In the end, only 1 to 2% of the sunlight falling on plants is captured by photosynthesis. This small percentage is the energy base for virtually all life in the biosphere. Figure 3.10. A colony of tube worms and mussels cluster over a cool, deep-sea methane seep in the Gulf of Mexico. Figure 3.11. The electromagnetic spectrum. Our eyes are sensitive to light wavelengths, which make up nearly half the energy that reaches the Earth's surface. Photosynthesizing plants also use the most abundant solar wavelengths. The Earth re-emits lower energy, longer wavelengths, mainly the infrared part of the spectrum. Photosynthesis captures energy, respiration releases that energy. Photosynthesis occurs in tiny organelles called chloroplasts that reside within plant cells. The main key to this process is chlorophyll, a green molecule that can absorb light energy and use the energy to create high-energy chemicals in compounds that serve as the fuel for all subsequent cellular metabolism. Chlorophyll doesn't do this important job all alone, however. It is assisted by a large group of other lipid, sugar, protein, and nucleotide molecules. Together, these components carry out two interconnected cyclic sets of reactions. Photosynthesis involves a sequence of reactions. Some photosynthetic reactions require energy from sunlight, and some don't. The process begins with a series of light-dependent reactions. These use solar energy directly to split water molecules into oxygen, O2, which is released to the atmosphere, and hydrogen. This is the source of all the oxygen in the atmosphere on which all animals, including you, depend for life. Separating the hydrogen atom from its electron produces H and an electron, both of which are used to form mobile, high-energy molecules called adenosine triphosphate and nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. Light-independent reactions then use the energy stored in ATP and NADPH molecules to create simple carbohydrates and sugar molecules from carbon atoms and water H2O. Glucose provides the energy and the building blocks for larger, more complex organic molecules. As ATP and NADPH give up some of their chemical energy, they are transformed to adenosine diphosphate and NADP. These molecules are then reused in another round of light-dependent reactions. In most temperate zone plants, photosynthesis can be summarized in the following equation. We read this equation as water plus carbon dioxide plus energy produces sugar plus oxygen. The reason the equation uses 6 water and 6 carbon dioxide molecules is that it takes 6 carbon atoms to make glucose. The CO2 in this equation is captured from the air by plant tissues. Thus, you could say that a plant is made primarily from air and water. What does the plant do with glucose? Because glucose is an energy-rich compound, it serves as the central, primary fuel for all cell growth and synthesis. The energy in its chemical bonds, created by photosynthesis, can be released by other enzymes and used to make other molecules, or it can drive kinetic processes, such as the movement of ions across membranes, the transmission of messages, changes in cellular shape or structure, or movement of the cell itself in some cases. This process of releasing chemical energy, called cellular respiration, involves splitting carbon and hydrogen atoms from the sugar molecule and recombining them with oxygen to recreate carbon dioxide and water. The net chemical reaction, then, is the reverse of photosynthesis. Note that in photosynthesis, energy is captured, while in respiration, energy is released. Similarly, photosynthesis consumes water and carbon dioxide to produce sugar and oxygen, while respiration does just the opposite. In both sets of reactions, chemical bonds are used to capture, store, and deliver energy within a cell. Plants carry out both photosynthesis and respiration, but during the day, if light, water, and CO2 are available, they have a net production of O and carbohydrates. Net primary productivity is the rate of biomass accumulation, that is, the sum of plant photosynthesis and respiration. We often describe ecosystems in terms of high NPP or low NPP. Rates of NPP depend largely on availability of suitable temperatures and sufficient water for photosynthesis. We animals don't have chlorophyll and can't carry out photosynthetic food production. We do perform cellular respiration, however. We eat plants or other animals that have eaten plants and break down the organic molecules in our food through cellular respiration to obtain energy. In the process, we also consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide, thus completing the cycle of photosynthesis and respiration. Figure 3.13 Energy exchange in ecosystems. Plants use sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to produce sugars and other organic molecules. Consumers use oxygen and break down sugars during cellular respiration. Plants also carry out respiration, but during the day, if light, water, and CO are available, they have a net production of O and carbohydrates. Section Review. 1. Restate the first and second laws of thermodynamics. 2. Explain kinetic energy, potential energy, high-quality energy, and low-quality energy. 3. What are primary producers? Consumers. 4. What is the source of carbon for green plants? What is one product of photosynthesis? 5. How are photosynthesis and respiration related? 3.2 Energy. Energy, ability to do work. Kinetic energy in moving objects. Potential, stored energy. Chemical, stored in food or fossil fuels. Heat energy that can be transferred between objects of different temperature. When a substance absorbs heat, the motion of its molecules increases and it may change state. Evaporation and condensation distribute heat around the globe. Thermodynamics. Energy must be supplied to keep biological processes running, because as it flows through the various biological processes, it becomes dissipated. First law of thermodynamics: energy is neither created nor destroyed. Second law of thermodynamics: with each successive energy transfer, less usable energy is available to perform work. Entropy increases. Example, entropy brick wall. 3.3 From species to ecosystems. Ecosystems consist of organisms and the systems they depend on. Food webs are structured by trophic levels. Higher trophic levels have fewer organisms and less mass than lower trophic levels. The Gulf of Mexico is part of a vast and complex system. The Mississippi River and land uses in its watershed influence the Gulf, as do currents and weather systems. The size and complexity of this system shows how difficult it can be to define boundaries around ecosystems. So we often define boundaries that make sense for the purposes at hand. We might discuss the Gulf as an ecosystem with its primary producers and other trophic levels, even though we know is integrally linked to other systems. In this section, we consider the components and definitions of ecosystems. Understanding how nutrients and energy function in a system, and where they come from, and where they go, are essential to understanding ecology, the scientific study of relationships between organisms and their environment. Ecosystems include living and non-living parts. To biologists, terms like species, population, and community have very particular meanings. In Latin, species literally means kind. In biology, species generally refers to all organisms of the same kind that are genetically similar enough to breed in nature and produce live, fertile offspring. There are important exceptions to this definition, and taxonomists increasingly use genetic differences to define species, but for our purposes this is a useful working definition. A population consists of all the members of a species living in a given area at the same time. All the populations living and interacting in a particular area make up a biological community. What populations make up the biological community of which you are a part? If you consider all the populations of animals, plants, fungi, and microorganisms in your area, your community is probably large and complex. We'll explore the dynamics of populations and communities more in chapters 4 and 6. As discussed in Chapter 2, systems are networks of interaction among many interdependent factors. Your body, for example, is a very complex, self-regulating system. An ecological system, or ecosystem, is composed of a biological community and its physical environment. The environment includes abiotic factors, such as climate, water, minerals, and sunlight, as well as biotic factors, such as organisms and their products and effects in a given area. It is useful to think about the biological community and its environment together, because energy and matter flow through both. Understanding how those flows work is a major theme in ecology. For simplicity, we think of ecosystems as distinct ecological units with fairly clear boundaries. If you look at a patch of woods surrounded by farm fields, for instance, a relatively sharp line might separate the two areas, and conditions such as light levels, wind, moisture, and shelter are quite different in the woods than in the fields around them. Because of these variations, distinct populations of plants and animals live in each place. By studying each of these areas, we can make important and interesting discoveries about who lives where and why, and about how conditions are established and maintained there. The division between the fields and woods is not always clear, however. Air, of course, moves freely from one to another, and the runoff after a rainfall may carry soil, leaf litter, and live organisms between the areas. Birds may feed in the field during the day, but roost in the woods at night, giving them roles in both places. Are they members of the woodland community, or the field community? Is the edge of the woodland ecosystem where the last tree grows, or does it extend to every place that has an influence on the woods? As you can see, it may be difficult to draw clear boundaries around communities and ecosystems. To some extent, we define these units by what we want to study and how much information we can handle. Thus, an ecosystem might be as large as a whole watershed, or as small as a pond, or even your own body. The thousands of species of bacteria, fungi, protozoans, and other organisms that live in and on your body make up a complex, interdependent community called the microbiome. You keep the other species warm and fed, they help you with digestion, nutrition, and other bodily functions. Some members of your community are harmful, but many are beneficial. You couldn't survive easily without them. We'll discuss your microbiome further in Chapter 4. You, as an ecosystem, have clear boundaries, but you are open in the sense that you take in food, water, energy, and oxygen from your surrounding environment, and you excrete wastes. This is true of most ecosystems, but some are relatively closed, that is, they import and export comparatively little from outside. Others, such as a stream, are in a constant state of flux with materials and even whole organisms coming and going. Because of the second law of thermodynamics, however, every ecosystem must have a constant inflow of energy and a way to dispose of heat. Thus, with regard to energy flow, every ecosystem is open. Many ecosystems have feedback mechanisms that maintain generally stable structures and functions. A forest tends to remain a forest, for the most part, and to have forest-like conditions if it isn't disturbed by outside forces. Some ecologists suggest that ecosystems, or perhaps all life on the Earth, may function as superorganisms, because they maintain stable conditions and can be resilient to change. Food webs link species of different trophic levels. All ecosystems are based on photosynthesis. Organisms that photosynthesize, mainly green plants and algae, are therefore known as producers. One of the major properties of an ecosystem is its productivity, the amount of biomass produced in a given area during a given period of time. Photosynthesis is described as primary productivity because it is the basis for almost all other growth in an ecosystem. Manufacture of biomass by organisms that eat plants is termed secondary productivity. A given ecosystem may have very high total productivity, but if decomposers decompose organic material as rapidly as it is formed, the net primary productivity will be low. Think about what you have eaten today, and trace it back to its photosynthetic source. If you have eaten an egg, you can trace it back to a chicken, which probably ate grain. This is an example of a food chain, a linked feeding series. Now think about a more complex food chain involving you, a chicken, a corn plant, and a grasshopper. The chicken could eat grasshoppers that had eaten leaves of the corn plant. You also could eat the grasshopper, directly some humans do. Or you could eat corn yourself, making the shortest possible food chain. Humans have several options of where we fit into food chains. In ecosystems, some consumers feed on a single species, but most consumers have multiple food sources. Similarly, some species are prey to a single kind of predator, but many species in an ecosystem are beset by several types of predators and parasites. In this way, individual food chains become interconnected to form a food web. Figure 3.14 shows feeding relationships among some of the larger organisms in a woodland and lake community. If we were to add all the insects, worms, and microscopic organisms that belong in this picture, however, we would have overwhelming complexity. Perhaps you can imagine the challenge ecologists face in trying to quantify and interpret the precise matter and energy transfers that occur in a natural ecosystem. An organism's feeding status in an ecosystem can be expressed as its trophic level. In our first example, the corn plant is at the producer level. It transforms solar energy into chemical energy, producing food molecules. Other organisms in the ecosystem are consumers of the chemical energy harnessed by the producers. An organism that eats producers is a primary consumer. An organism that eats primary consumers is a secondary consumer, which may, in turn, be eaten by a tertiary consumer, and so on. Most terrestrial food chains are relatively short, but aquatic food chains may be quite long. The length of a food chain also may reflect the physical characteristics of a particular ecosystem. A harsh Arctic landscape, with relatively low species diversity, can have a much shorter food chain than a temperate or tropical one. Organisms can be identified both by the trophic level at which they feed and by the kinds of food they eat. Herbivores are plant eaters, carnivores are flesh eaters, and omnivores eat both plant and animal matter. What are humans? We are natural omnivores, by history and by habit. Tooth structure is an important clue to understanding animal food preferences, and humans are no exception. Our teeth are suited for an omnivorous diet, with a combination of cutting and crushing surfaces that are not highly adapted for one specific kind of food, as are the teeth of a wolf or a horse. One of the most important trophic levels is occupied by the many kinds of organisms that remove and recycle the dead bodies and waste products of others. Scavengers such as crows, jackals, and vultures clean up dead carcasses of larger animals. Detritivores such as ants and beetles consume detritus litter, debris, and dung, while decomposer organisms such as fungi and bacteria complete the final breakdown and recycling of organic materials. It could be argued that these microorganisms are second in importance only to producers, because without their activity, nutrients would remain locked up in the organic compounds of dead organisms and discarded body wastes, rather than being made available to successive generations of organisms. Figure 3.14. Each time an organism feeds, it becomes a link in a food chain. In an ecosystem, food chains become interconnected when predators feed on more than one kind of prey, thus forming a food web. The arrows in this diagram, and in figure 3.15, indicate the direction in which matter and energy are transferred through feeding relationships. Only a few representative relationships are shown here. What others might you add? Figure 3.15. Harsh environments tend to have shorter food chains than environments with more favorable physical conditions. Compare the Arctic food chains depicted here with the longer food chains in the food web in figure 3.14. Figure 3.16. Organisms in an ecosystem may be identified by how they obtain food for their life processes, or by consumer level, or by trophic level. Ecological pyramids describe trophic levels. If we arrange the organisms according to trophic levels, they generally form a pyramid with a broad base representing primary producers, and only a few individuals in the highest trophic levels. Quantitative reasoning. As a rule of thumb, about 1/10 of the energy, or biomass consumed is stored at each trophic level. About how many kilograms of feed should it take to produce 1 kilogram of chicken meat that we eat? How much more energy should it take to provide you a meal of meat compared to vegetables? This pyramid arrangement is especially true if we look at the energy content of an ecosystem. Why is there so much less energy in each successive level in figure 3.17? Because of the second law of thermodynamics, which says that energy dissipates and degrades as it is reused. Thus, a rabbit consumes a great deal of chemical energy stored in carbohydrates in grass, and much of that energy is transformed to kinetic energy when the rabbit moves, or to heat, which dissipates to the environment. A fox eats the rabbit, and the same degradation and dissipation happen again. As the fox uses the energy to live, some is lost in heat or movement. A little of the energy it has eaten is stored in chemical bonds in the fox's tissues. From an ecosystem energy perspective, there will always be smaller amounts of energy at successively higher trophic levels. Large top carnivores need a very large pyramid and a large home range to support them. A tiger, for example, may require a home range of several hundred square kilometers to survive. As a broad generalization, only about 1/10 of the energy in one trophic level is represented in the next higher level. The amount of energy available is often expressed in biomass. For example, it generally takes about 100 kilograms of clover to produce 10 kilograms of rabbit, and 10 kilograms of rabbit to make 1 kilogram of fox. The total number of organisms and the total amount of biomass in each successive trophic level of an ecosystem also may form pyramids similar to those describing energy content. The relationship between biomass and numbers is not as dependable as energy, however. The biomass pyramid, for instance, can be inverted by periodic fluctuations in producer populations. The numbers pyramid also can be inverted. One coyote can support numerous tapeworms, for example. Numbers inversion also occurs at the lower trophic levels. Figure 3.17, a classic example of an energy pyramid from Silver Springs, Florida. The numbers in each bar show the percentage of the energy captured in the primary producer level that is incorporated into the biomass of each succeeding level. Detritivores and decomposers feed at every level, but are shown attached to the producer bar, because this level provides most of their energy. Figure 3.18, a biomass pyramid shows that, like energy, biomass storage decreases at higher trophic levels. Figure 3.19, usually, smaller organisms are eaten by larger organisms, and it takes numerous small organisms to feed one large organism. The classic study represented in this pyramid shows numbers of individuals at each trophic level per 1,000 m of grassland, and reads like this. To support one individual at the top carnivore level, there were 90,000 primary carnivores feeding upon 200,000 herbivores that in turn fed upon 1,500. 000 producers. Section Review. 1. Describe the following: producers, consumers, secondary consumers, decomposers. 2. Ecosystems require energy to function. Where does this energy go as it is used? How does the flow of energy conform to the laws of thermodynamics? 3. Why are there generally fewer organisms at the top of the food pyramid than at the bottom? 3.3 Energy for life. Ultimately, most organisms depend on the sun for the energy needed to carry out life processes. A few very ancient organisms, called archaea, are able to get their energy from inorganic compounds that bubble up from vents in the sea floor or from hot springs. Example: black smokers, bacteria extract energy from sulfur gas. Example: hydrothermal vents, black smokers. Energy from the sun. Solar energy is essential for two reasons. Warmth: most organisms can exist only in a relatively narrow temperature range. Photosynthesis in plants. Radiant energy is transformed into useful, high-quality chemical energy in the bonds of organic molecules. Most life on Earth depends on photosynthesis. Energy for life. Of all solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface, about 10% is ultraviolet, 45% is visible, and 45% is infrared. Most of this energy is absorbed by land or water or reflected back into space. Only about 1 to 2% of the sunlight falling on plants is captured for photosynthesis. Electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthesis occurs in organelles called chloroplasts within plant cells. 6H 2 O plus 6 Co 2 plus solar energy C 6 H 12 O 6 plus 6 O 2. What is being oxidized? Reduced. Water and carbon dioxide in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll yield glucose and oxygen. Glucose serves as primary fuel for all metabolic processes. Energy in its chemical bonds can be used to make other molecules such as proteins, fuel cellular movement, or transport of ions across membranes. 32. Photosynthesis. Cellular respiration. Photosynthesis captures energy, while cellular respiration releases energy. Cellular respiration splits carbon and hydrogen atoms from sugar and recombines them with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water. This is how animals get all their energy. The reason that you need to breathe is to supply this pathway with oxygen. C 6 H 12 O 6 plus 6O 2 6H 2 O plus 6 Co 2 plus energy. Respiration and photosynthesis are part of the same cycle. 3.4 Material cycles. The water cycle distributes water among atmosphere, biosphere, surface, and groundwater. Carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus are among the essential elements that also move through biological, atmospheric, and Earth systems. Earth is the only planet in our solar system that provides a suitable environment for life as we know it. Even our nearest planetary neighbors, Mars and Venus, do not meet these requirements. Maintenance of these conditions requires a constant recycling of materials between the biotic and abiotic components of ecosystems. The hydrologic cycle redistributes water. The path of water through our environment, known as the hydrologic cycle, is perhaps the most familiar material cycle, and it is discussed in greater detail in Chapter 17. Most of the Earth's water is stored in the oceans, but solar energy continually evaporates this water, and winds distribute water vapor around the globe. Water that condenses over land surfaces, in the form of rain, snow, or fog, supports all terrestrial ecosystems. Living organisms emit the moisture they have consumed through respiration and perspiration. Eventually, this moisture re-enters the atmosphere, or enters lakes and streams, from which it ultimately returns to the ocean again. As it moves through living things and through the atmosphere, water is responsible for metabolic processes within cells, for maintaining the flows of key nutrients through ecosystems, and for global-scale distribution of heat and energy. Water performs countless services because of its unusual properties. Water is so important that when astronomers look for signs of life on distant planets, traces of water are the key evidence they seek. Everything about global hydrological processes is awesome in scale. Each year, the Sun evaporates approximately 496,000 kilometers of water from the Earth's surface. More water evaporates in the tropics than at higher latitudes, and more water evaporates over the oceans than over land. Although the oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surface, they account for 86% of total evaporation. 90% of the water evaporated from the ocean falls back on the ocean as rain. The remaining 10% is carried by prevailing winds over the continents, where it combines with water evaporated from soil, plant surfaces, lakes, streams, and wetlands to provide a total continental precipitation of about 111,000 kilometers. What happens to the surplus water on land? The difference between what falls as precipitation and what evaporates. Some of it is incorporated by plants and animals into biological tissues. A large share of what falls on land seeps into the ground to be stored for a while as soil moisture or groundwater. Water might stay for just a few days or weeks in soil and shallow groundwater. In deep aquifers, water can reside for centuries or millennia. Eventually, all the water makes its way back downhill to the oceans. The 40,000 kilometers carried back to the ocean each year by surface runoff or underground flow is the renewable supply available for human uses and sustaining freshwater-dependent ecosystems. Figure 3.20 The hydrologic cycle. Most exchange occurs with evaporation from oceans and precipitation back to oceans. About 1/10 of water evaporated from oceans falls over land, is recycled through terrestrial systems, and eventually drains back to oceans in rivers. Carbon cycles through earth, air, water, and life. Carbon serves a dual purpose for organisms. It is a structural component of organic molecules, and the energy-holding chemical bonds it forms represent energy storage. The carbon cycle begins with the intake of carbon dioxide by photosynthetic organisms. Photosynthesis produces plant cells from carbon in the air. Carbon dioxide is eventually released during respiration, closing the cycle. The carbon cycle is of special interest because biological accumulation and release of carbon is a major factor in climate regulation. The path followed by an individual carbon atom in this cycle may be quite direct and rapid, depending on how it is used in an organism's body. Imagine for a moment what happens to a simple sugar molecule you swallow in a glass of fruit juice. The sugar molecule is absorbed into your bloodstream, where it is made available to your cells for cellular respiration, or for making more complex biomolecules. If it is used in respiration, you may exhale the same carbon atom as CO the same day. Some forms of carbon cycle extremely slowly. Coal and oil are the compressed, chemically altered remains of plants or microorganisms that lived millions of years ago. Their carbon atoms are not released until the coal and oil are burned. We dramatically accelerate the movement of this carbon when we use fossil fuels. Enormous amounts of carbon also are locked up as calcium carbonate, used to build shells and skeletons of marine organisms from tiny protozoans to corals. Most of these deposits are at the bottom of the oceans. The world's extensive surface limestone deposits are biologically formed calcium carbonate from ancient oceans, exposed by geological events. The carbon in limestone has been locked away for millennia, which is probably the fate of carbon currently being deposited in ocean sediments. Eventually, even the deep ocean deposits are recycled, as they are drawn into deep molten layers and released via volcanic activity. Geologists estimate that every carbon atom on the Earth has made about 30 such round trips over the last 4 billion years. How does tying up so much carbon in the bodies and byproducts of organisms affect the biosphere? Favorably. It helps balance CO2 generation and utilization. Carbon dioxide is one of the so-called greenhouse gases, because it absorbs heat radiated from the Earth's surface, retaining it instead in the atmosphere. Photosynthesis, accumulation of organic matter in soils and wetlands, and deposition of CaCO. 3. Remove atmospheric carbon dioxide, therefore, expansive forested areas, such as the boreal forests and the oceans, are very important carbon sinks. Cellular respiration and combustion both release CO, so they are referred to as carbon sources in the cycle. Presently, combustion of organic fuels, removal of standing forests, and soil degradation are releasing huge quantities of CO at rates that surpass the pace of CO2 removal, a problem discussed in chapters 15 and 16. Figure 3.21. The carbon cycle. Numbers indicate the approximate exchange of carbon in gigatons per year. Natural exchanges are balanced, but human sources produce a net increase of CO in the atmosphere. Figure 3.22. The roots of this bean plant are covered with bumps called nodules. Each nodule is a mass of root tissue containing many bacteria that help to convert nitrogen in the soil to a form the bean plants can assimilate and use to manufacture amino acids. Nitrogen occurs in many forms. Nitrogen is essential for living organisms, and it is often a key limiting factor in ecosystems. Nitrogen shortages slow biological productivity, a primary concern for farmers, for example. A surplus of nitrogen, as in the Gulf of Mexico's dead zone and in many other marine ecosystems, causes eutrophication, a common and often severe problem in aquatic systems. Nitrogen is critical because it is an essential component of proteins, enzymes, DNA, and countless other organic compounds. Primary producers incorporate nitrogen into these compounds, and consumers, such as yourself, acquire nitrogen by consuming plants or animals that have eaten plants. Nitrogen is abundant in our environment. Nitrogen gas molecules, N2, make up 78% of our atmosphere. But these nitrogen molecules have strong bonds, and green plants can't use nitrogen from N directly. Plants rely on bacteria living in soils, in plant tissues, or in aquatic systems to capture N2. These nitrogen-fixing bacteria have proteins that can break the N bonds. The N is then available to be combined with hydrogen to form NH3. Or NH ammonium. The plus indicates that the molecule has a positive ionic charge. Bacteria can gain energy by recombining these molecules with oxygen to form NO2 or NO3. Of the many nitrogen compounds, only 2, nitrate, NO, and ammonium, NH4, can be used directly by plants. These are the sources of nitrogen for forming amino acids, the building blocks for complex organic compounds such as proteins. Some plants, such as those in the bean and clover families, have nitrogen-fixing bacteria that reside in their roots. In beans, these bacteria live in nodules on plant roots. Having resident bacteria gives these plants built-in fertilizer. In return, the plant gives carbohydrates to the bacteria. This symbiotic relationship also enriches soil, so farmers often rotate legumes, such as beans, with nitrogen-hungry crops such as corn. Using natural fertilizers this way can improve both soil and productivity. Bacteria in soil or water provide chemical reactions that drive many parts of the complex nitrogen cycle. Where oxygen is available, bacteria may combine ammonia with oxygen to form nitrous oxide, nitric oxide, nitrite, NO, or nitrate, NO3. In oxygen-poor conditions, such as in streambed sediments, saturated soils, or wetlands, denitrifying bacteria may remove oxygen from nitrate to form gaseous compounds, especially nitrous oxide or nitrogen gas. Conversion to these gaseous forms is known as denitrification. Denitrification can be important in removing nitrogen from aquatic systems that suffer from eutrophication. Nitrogen moves through the food web as organisms die, decompose, or are consumed. Decomposers release ammonia and ammonium ions, which then are available for nitrate formation. Organisms also release proteins when plants shed their leaves, needles, flowers, fruits, and cones, or when animals shed hair, feathers, skin, exoskeletons, pupal cases, and silk, excrement, or urine, all of which are rich in nitrogen. Urinary wastes are especially high in nitrogen because they contain the detoxified wastes of protein metabolism. Humans now capture a great deal of atmospheric nitrogen, and our activities have more than doubled the amount of nitrogen in circulation. Synthetic ammonia fertilizers are largely responsible. This form of nitrogen is produced from atmospheric nitrogen and natural gas under extreme heat and pressure. The spread of nitrogen-fixing soybeans, now one of the world's dominant crops, has also increased nitrogen capture. Even more important is the burning of fossil fuels in car engines and industrial furnaces. The high heat and pressure of combustion fix N to form ammonia or nitrous oxide, N. 2. O. Rainfall washes these compounds out of the air and into soils and aquatic ecosystems. Excessive nitrogen fertilization is a dominant pollutant in many destabilized rivers, lakes, and estuaries. In terrestrial systems, nitrogen enrichment encourages the spread of weeds into ecosystems that historically had low N inputs. In addition, nitrous oxide, N. 2. O, is an important greenhouse gas. Figure 3.23. The nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen occurs in many different forms. Human activities have doubled the amount of nitrogen circulating, mainly because of industry, gasoline combustion in transportation, and agricultural fertilizers. Units are teragrams of nitrogen per year. Table 3.2. Common forms of nitrogen. Nitrogen gas makes up 78% of atmosphere, can be fixed by bacteria, cyanobacteria, some marine algae. Ammonia, gaseous form, corrosive, common agricultural fertilizer that bonds with H to form NH. Ammonium NH directly usable by plants, positive charge helps adhere to clays in soils. Nitrite. NO. Ion with negative electrical charge, a step in nitrification process, conversion of NH to NO, toxic to plants. Usually present temporarily, or in low quantities. Nitrate NO directly usable by plants, product of nitrification. Organic nitrogen. Diverse compounds, such as proteins, must be converted to NH for use by plants. Organic to inorganic transition is mineralization. Nitrogen oxides NO. Various combinations such as NO, NO, and NO, fuel combustion in vehicles and industry produces most NO. Rainfall washes NO into soils and waterways. NO and N also result from denitrification by bacteria. Phosphorus follows a one-way path. Phosphorus is an essential component of all cells. Compounds containing this element store and release a great deal of energy, so phosphorus-containing compounds, such as ATP, are primary participants in energy transfer reactions in cells. Phosphorus is also a key component of proteins, enzymes, and tissues. The amount of available phosphorus in an ecosystem can have a dramatic effect on productivity. Low levels of phosphorus can limit plant growth. Abundant phosphorus stimulates lush plant and algal growth, making it a major water pollutant. Most plants acquire phosphorus from soil, and animals acquire phosphorus by consuming plants or other animals. The ultimate source of phosphorus, though, is rocks. On the scale of centuries, the phosphorus cycle is really a one-way path. This is because phosphorus has no atmospheric form, in which it can quickly recirculate. Instead, phosphorus travels gradually downstream, as it is leached from rocks and minerals, taken up by the food web, and eventually released into water bodies that deliver it to the ocean. Phosphorus cycles repeatedly through the food web, as inorganic phosphorus is taken up by plants, incorporated into organic molecules, and passed on to consumers. Eventually, though, phosphorus washes down river to the ocean, where it accumulates in ocean sediments. Over geologic time, these deposits can be uplifted and exposed, so they become available to terrestrial life again. The phosphate used for detergents and fertilizers today are mined from exposed ocean sediments millions of years old. As with nitrogen, we have dramatically accelerated the movement of phosphorus in our environment. The effects of this increased phosphorus on aquatic ecosystems, as in the Gulf of Mexico, can include explosive growth of algae and photosynthetic bacteria, or eutrophication. Phosphorus is essential for agriculture. There are worries about how long global phosphorus supplies will last. Some authorities estimate that we have several hundred years' worth of this essential mineral. Others worry that we may run out much sooner than that. Figure 3.24 The phosphorus cycle. Natural movement of phosphorus is slight, involving recycling within ecosystems and some erosion and sedimentation of phosphorus-bearing rock. Use of phosphate fertilizers and cleaning agents increases phosphorus in aquatic systems, causing eutrophication. Units are teragrams phosphorus per year. Section Review. 1. What do we mean by carbon fixation, or nitrogen fixation? Why is it important to humans that carbon and nitrogen be fixed? 2. Why is nitrogen important to living things? What type of organism is responsible for making nitrogen available to plants? 3. Describe the relative residence time of water in the ocean, the atmosphere, and in rivers and lakes. 4. In what forms is carbon stored in oceans, the atmosphere, living things, and rocks? 3.4 From species to ecosystems. Species, all organisms of the same kind that are genetically similar enough to breed in nature and produce live, fertile offspring. Population, all members of a species living in a given area at the same time. Biological community, all of the populations of organisms living and interacting in a particular area. 35. From species to ecosystems. Ecosystem, biological community, and its physical environment. The physical environment includes non-living factors such as climate, water, minerals, sunlight. It is difficult to define the boundaries of an ecosystem. Most ecosystems are open in that they exchange materials and organisms with other ecosystems. 36. 37. Example. Food chains and food webs. Food chain linked feeding series. Food web interconnected food chains as. Most consumers have multiple food sources. Trophic level, an organism's feeding status in a food web. Plants are at the producer level while animals are consumers. Herbivore, carnivore, omnivore. Scavenger. Detritivore. Trough means to eat. Where do they eat in their food web? 39. A food web. 40. 41. Ecological pyramids. If the organisms at various trophic levels of a food chain are arranged diagrammatically, they form a pyramid with many more producers than consumers forming the broad base of the pyramid. Due to the second law of thermodynamics, energy is lost at each level of the pyramid. Energy is lost as heat in metabolic processes. 10% rule. 100 kilograms clover. 10 kilograms rabbit. 1 kilogram fox. 42. 43. Population energy pyramid. 44. Energy loss within a food chain. 45. Material cycles. Hydrologic cycle path of water through the environment. Evaporation, transpiration, precipitation. 46. Carbon cycle. 1. Begins with intake of CO. 2. During photosynthesis, carbon atoms are incorporated fixed into sugar, C. 6. H. 12. O. 6. 2. Carbon is eventually released by cellular respiration, as the sugar is burned or when decomposition occurs. 3. Sometimes the carbon is not recycled for a long time. Coal and oil are the remains of organisms that lived millions of years ago. The carbon in these is released when we burn them. Carbon cycle. The parts of the cycle that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere are called carbon sinks. The parts of the cycle that release carbon dioxide are called carbon sources. Burning of fuels generates huge quantities of carbon dioxide that cannot be taken up fast enough by the carbon sinks. This excess carbon dioxide contributes to global warming. 47. 48. Carbon cycle. Food chains and food webs. Photosynthesis is at the base of all ecosystems, so photosynthesizers are called the producers. Productivity, the amount of biomass produced in a given area, in a given period of time. Photosynthesis is called primary productivity, because it is basic to all other growth in an ecosystem. Secondary productivity, manufacture of biomass by organisms that eat plants. Connecting the dots. Ecosystems, and all living things, persist by capturing, using, and recycling energy and matter. Understanding the different states of energy, and the different kinds of elements, isotopes, and molecules used by living things helps us understand how ecosystems function. These ideas help us piece together the problem of eutrophication in the Gulf of Mexico. The annual hypoxic zone, or dead zone, in the Gulf results from an influx of nutrients, especially nitrogen, from fertilizers upstream. Hypoxic zones are increasing in number and frequency worldwide. Human activities that capture nitrogen have more than doubled the flow of nitrogen through ecosystems, creating these imbalances. Nitrogen is just one of a number of elements necessary for living cells, but it is a key element both in cellular energy transfer and in the formation of proteins and cell components. Yet it is only available in nature because bacteria capture it from the atmosphere. Carbon and oxygen, also necessary elements of cells and energy transfer, are not limiting factors in ecosystems because all green plants can capture CO from the air to build cells and capture energy in sugars and starches. The first and second laws of thermodynamics, which state that energy is conserved but also degraded as it is used, also helps us understand the structure of ecosystems. Of the energy an organism captures, most is dissipated, for example, as heat or kinetic energy. Only about 1/10 as much energy is stored at successively higher trophic levels. This explains why an abundance of plant supports only a few herbivores, and even fewer predators. Keep these principles in mind as you read later chapters in this book. These principles help us understand the function and organization of environmental systems all around us. Critical thinking and discussion questions. 1. If your dishwasher detergents contained phosphorus, would you change brands? Would you encourage others to change? Why or why not? 2. Describe one or two practical examples of the laws of thermodynamics in your own life. Do they help explain why you can recycle cans and bottles but not energy? Which law is responsible for the fact that you get hot and sweaty when you exercise? 3. The ecosystem concept revolutionized ecology by introducing holistic systems thinking as opposed to individualistic life history studies. Why was this a conceptual breakthrough? 4. If ecosystems are so difficult to delimit, why is this such a persistent concept? Can you imagine any other ways to define or delimit environmental investigation? 5. Choose one of the material cycles and identify the components of the cycle in which you participate. For which of these components would it be easiest to reduce your impacts? To review: what is matter, and what is the principle behind the conservation of matter? What is an atom, and what are the corresponding charges of its subatomic particles? Be able to distinguish between elements, compounds, and molecules. What is the difference between a covalent bond and an ionic bond? What is an ion? What range of pH determines if a substance is acidic, neutral, or basic? What is an organic compound? Recognize the difference between potential or kinetic energy. Define and distinguish between the first and second laws of thermodynamics. To review: review the equations for photosynthesis and cell respiration. Distinguish between a species, population, community, and ecosystem. What is a producer and consumer? If given an example, be able to indicate whether an organism is a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, or tertiary consumer. What acts as a carbon source? A carbon sink. Key terms: principle of conservation of matter, atom, proton, neutron, electron, element, molecule, ionic bond, covalent bond, acidic, basic, organic compound, enzyme, potential energy, kinetic energy, first law of thermodynamics, second law of thermodynamics, photosynthesis, cell respiration. Species, population, community, ecosystem, producer, primary producer, consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, carbon sink, carbon source.